At first glance, Greenland sounds like a joke, a frozen island, a place with more ice than people, and yet every few decades it quietly re-enters global conversations, as if history keeps tripping over it. Recently, the idea surfaced again, not as a plan, not as a policy, but as a suggestion that made people laugh first and then pause. What most people don't realize is that this reaction has happened before, again and again. Different centuries, different leaders, same island. The strange part isn't that powerful countries talk about Greenland. The strange part is when they do, because Greenland only becomes important at very specific moments in history, moments when global power starts shifting, when distance begins to matter again, when maps stop being theoretical and start becoming urgent. This isn't about politics, and it isn't about personalities. It's about why certain places remain irrelevant, right up until they suddenly aren't. And once you see the pattern, Greenland stops looking like a joke at all. The first time Greenland stopped being invisible wasn't recent, and it wasn't modern. It happened in the 19th century, when empires still measured power in months, not milliseconds, and oceans were counted in weeks of travel. At the time, Greenland had no obvious value, no oil, no rare minerals, no melting ice opening shortcuts. On paper, it was empty, but it sat in a very specific place, between continents, between expanding trade routes, between what empires controlled and what they were only beginning to reach. As global trade expanded and naval power stretched farther from home, distance became a problem again. Not politically, logistically. Ships needed refueling points. Routes needed protection. Messages needed places to pause before continuing. And the North Atlantic, once a barrier, began behaving like a corridor. Greenland didn't block that corridor. It watched it. Quietly, interest appeared, not as conquest, not as invasion, but as planning. The question wasn't who wanted Greenland. The question was what happens when reaction time starts to matter, and someone else controls the space you suddenly depend on. No announcement followed, no headline, but the pattern had begun. The pattern didn't repeat because Greenland changed. It repeated because the world did. As technology advanced, empires believed distance had been solved. Steam replaced sail, telegraph replaced couriers. Later, radar replaced eyesight. For a while, geography felt irrelevant, but distance never disappears. It only waits. Every time global power stretches faster than its ability to react, the same problem returns. Not control, reaction time. The moment reaction time matters, geography reasserts itself. That's when maps stop being symbolic and start behaving like instruments. Greenland sits at a very specific intersection, not of borders, but of trajectories, between North America and Europe, between the Atlantic and the Arctic, between launch points and interception paths. When the world is stable, that position is irrelevant. Trade flows are predictable, threats move slowly, decisions have time. But when stability erodes, speed becomes power. Messages shorten, supply lines tighten, detection windows shrink. Suddenly, what matters is not who has more assets, but who sees first, and who can respond before the other side does. That's when Greenland re-enters the conversation, not as territory, not as identity, but as infrastructure, a fixed platform that cannot be moved, a reference point that compresses distance, a place where reaction time is bought, not negotiated. This is why Greenland never appears alone in history. It surfaces alongside moments of transition, when older systems struggle to keep up, when new technologies shorten timelines, when power becomes less about ownership and more about positioning. The irony is that none of this feels dramatic while it's happening. There are no declarations, no countdowns, just quiet adjustments, planning, recalibration. And then, years later, people ask the same question again. Why did Greenland suddenly matter? By then, the answer has already been written into the map. The shift didn't announce itself. There was no moment when the world declared that the Arctic had become strategic again. It happened quietly. As technology accelerated, the planet began to shrink in an unexpected way. Not physically, but temporally. Weapons traveled faster. Signals crossed oceans instantly. Decisions that once took weeks now had to be made in minutes. And once again, distance stopped being about miles and started being about reaction time. This is where the Arctic returned to the map, not as wilderness, but as infrastructure. During the 20th century, something changed in how conflict was imagined. Power was no longer projected only across borders. It moved through airspace, through trajectories, through paths that ignored politics and followed physics. The shortest route between major powers was no longer across land or sea. It was over the pole. Suddenly, the empty spaces at the top of the world weren't empty at all. They were corridors. Early warning systems appeared, listening posts, runways carved into ice, installations designed not to fight wars, but to detect them early enough to matter. Greenland wasn't chosen because it was ideal. It was chosen because it was unavoidable. If something crossed the Arctic, Greenland would see it first. That logic never disappeared. It simply went quiet. When tensions eased, the systems remained, maintained, modernized, rarely discussed. And then the world began changing again. New technologies shortened timelines even further. Satellites multiplied, missiles moved faster, cyber systems blurred the line between peace and conflict. The margin for error shrank. In this environment, geography stopped being passive. It became active, a place that could host sensors, tracking systems, and infrastructure without negotiation, without transit delays, without reliance on foreign corridors, became invaluable. Not because it granted control, but because it reduced uncertainty. Greenland fit that requirement perfectly. And here's the part that's easy to miss. No one needed to conquer it. No one needed to announce anything. The systems already existed. They simply gained weight. What once felt like over-engineering began to look like foresight. What once seemed excessive became necessary. This is how strategic importance actually forms, not with speeches, not with flags, but with quiet upgrades, extended runways, new sensors, expanded coverage. By the time the public notices, the logic is already embedded. And that's when the old question returns, not from historians, but from the present. Why does Greenland matter now? The answer isn't that it suddenly changed. It's that the world reached another moment where speed outweighed distance, and the Arctic stopped being distant again. What's happening now isn't new, and it isn't sudden. It's the same pattern returning under different conditions. Every time the world convinces itself that distance has been defeated, that speed has solved geography, the same locations quietly regain relevance, not because they changed, but because the systems around them did. Greenland doesn't force its way into history. It waits. It waits for moments when timelines compress, when reaction windows narrow, when stability becomes fragile enough that planning moves ahead of explanation. By the time headlines appear, the decisions are already old. Runways are already extended. Sensors are already calibrated. Coverage is already mapped. The conversation always arrives last. That's why debates about Greenland sound strange to the public. They feel abrupt, unnecessary, almost absurd. But to the systems that operate on seconds instead of years, the logic is obvious. Greenland matters not because someone wants it, but because moments arise when control is less important than presence. Less about owning space, more about standing where time converges. And when those moments pass, Greenland fades again, back into silence, back into irrelevance, until the world reaches the next threshold, and history trips over the same island one more time.